of some of the issues related to citizen suits over environmental issues, environmental decision making. So we're in the middle of standing, right? And so we're going to talk about Massachusetts versus EPA. I looked for a picture of the Massachusetts coast, and this was when I worked in Boston the summer after my first year of law school with more hair back then. So right, so this is anyway. So this is what the Massachusetts coast looked like in 1988. All right, so we're going to finish this up. We're going to deal with ripeness, exhaustion of administrative remedies. Then we will transition into talking about how environmental law has changed over time. Okay, we're going to do part of this class session, and then we're going to do we're going to continue on Monday. Part of your reading involves some of the changes that are underway currently in the Trump administration with respect to environmental regulations and so forth, right? So that was part of the reading. What I'd like for everyone to do for Monday is to come prepared to talk about which of the Trump administration changes you most agree with. Now, you may disagree with every single one of them, but which one, so let's look at it the other way. Which one do you disagree with the least, right? Okay? And which one do you most disagree with? So some of you may favor every single one of them, may agree with all of them, but you should then come in and talk about the one that you think is least desirable. Okay, so most most willing to live with, and one that you most don't want to live with. Okay, so we'll talk about that on Monday. All right, Massachusetts versus EPA. Many of you studied this in common law. It is a significant case regarding standing, and of course it involves climate change. So the issue here in Massachusetts versus EPA is whether the state of Massachusetts and other states, but particularly the state of Massachusetts, could sue the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency over the failure of the EPA to list selected greenhouse gases as pollutants under the Clean Air Act. Okay, so the EPA had failed to list greenhouse gases, which are carbon and nitrogen, those sorts of things, as pollutants under the Clean Air Act, and the question is, were they required to? Okay, and to jump ahead to the substance of it, the court says the language of the Clean Air Act does indeed require the agency to list it if those greenhouse gases are going to have an adverse effect on human health. Okay? And there's evidence that they will, but just the failure to even consider it was an abuse of the agency's discretion. So they said the agency could decide not to list them after doing an analysis, but the refusal to make a decision to consider whether the greenhouse gases qualified as a pollutant under the Clean Air Act was an abuse of discretion. So that's the substance. But the interesting thing where we are right now is whether Massachusetts has standing to sue the US EPA. Now let's think about this for a moment. And by the way, the case involved the greenhouse gases from mobile sources. Okay, so the stationary sources was a different matter altogether. So mobile sources are cars, vehicles, that kind of thing, right? And stationary sources are like power plants. So they're two separate kinds of things. And so the point is that the agency was required to do that. Well, think about this for a moment. Let's assume for a moment that the EPA decides to regulate greenhouse gases from mobile sources, and they put some, certain kinds of requirements on car manufacturers or vehicle manufacturers to limit the carbon and nitrogen emissions, okay, so forth, right? So that's a possibility. What kind of overall impact will that have on climate change? Okay? Climate change is the ways in which we are altering our climate by put these greenhouse gases in the air, and they operate just like a greenhouse does, right? They end up trapping the heat in. Also, they end up, because of the way that then affects moisture uptake from the ocean and so forth, it also means that hurricanes, like what we've got going on with Dorian, right, tend to be more intense and so on and so forth. But this is obviously a global phenomenon, right? There are multiple sources, okay, so not only vehicles, but also power plants and other kinds of industrial sources, but also livestock, okay? A major contributor of greenhouse gases has to do with methane emissions from cows and other livestock, right? Okay, so you've got all of that, methane emissions from landfills. And then also things like deforestation. Basically carbon that is been captured in, hold on just a second. Hello? Carbon that has been captured in various kinds of vegetation, trees, and that kind of stuff. Also in wetlands, right? So wetlands are a place where there's a lot of various greenhouse gases that have been captured. So when we alter those, when we destroy those, we release those into the atmosphere. We don't have as much sequestered in nature, and so on and so forth. So the point is that there are lots of contributors to climate change, and they are obviously worldwide. So one of the things that's it has been the basis of the current administration's decision to pull back from international agreements concerning climate change is the argument that nations like China and India are major contributors and they aren't doing their share, so why should the U.S.? So that's this part of the argument there. So the point is, more generally, what can the EPA do? Okay, I mean, how much can the EPA solve the problem? So that's one of the issues. Massachusetts, why is Massachusetts suing? Well, partly they would like to see more environmental regulation of greenhouse gases. That is a popular regulatory policy in Massachusetts, but it's also because quite a bit of Massachusetts is coastline, and that coastline is eroding. It is subject to heightened levels of storm surge. It's subject to flooding and sea level rise, and that is affecting development in Massachusetts, property values, economic activity. It's requiring that Massachusetts engage in more disaster response and management, and so on and so forth. And so, so that's the basis for their claim. So the court goes through this, and by the way, this is where I kind of sort of say, in environmental law, we're going to take climate change for a given, because in Massachusetts versus EPA, all of the justices take the phenomenon of human-caused or human contributions to climate change as a given, and they sort of say, but what is the legal duty with respect to it. And they disagree about standing, and they would disagree about the legal responsibility for it. And so you want to incorporate this into your standing notes, but in terms of injury in fact, the majority of Massachusetts versus EPA focuses on the fact that Massachusetts has sort of a trust duty and special sovereignty interest in protecting its diminishing coastal lands from climate change, which is caused in part from EPA's failure to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. And this is partly based on the state's public trust doctrine, the fact that the coastal lands are subject to the public trust in Massachusetts, which means that the state of Massachusetts has a fiduciary duty to its citizens to protect the coastline and manage the coastline for their benefit. In addition, the state, like every state, has the police power, okay, which is authority to regulate, to protect the public health, safety, morals, and welfare, but the court recognizes inherent in that is a certain duty to the citizens to look out for their interests, okay? And so in this respect, according to the majority, states are different than environmental groups, states are different than industry groups, states are different than basically other parties, other potential parties in this lawsuit or in action, any other lawsuit. So they majority recognize a special standing for states when its trust duties and sovereignty interests are affected. And Georgia versus Tennessee Copper, it's a very old case, has to do with basically interstate nuisance claims, right? It's actually Justice Holmes' case, and Georgia versus Tennessee Copper recognized the authority of a state to sue on behalf of its citizens for pollution coming from another state. Okay, and so that's a foundation of this. The dissent says there is no precedent for special standing for states. They just sort of seem to ignore Georgia versus Tennessee Copper, but this is actually not the most significant part of the dissent anyway, so we won't worry too much about that. But that is the injury in fact. Causation is more problematic. But the majority says that the EPA's failure to regulate contributes to Massachusetts injuries because when the EPA fails to regulate, that means more greenhouse gas emissions, which means more climate change, which means more harm to Massachusetts coastal lands. Okay, so they follow the chain of causation. The dissent says that the complexity of global warming makes it impossible to trace Massachusetts' loss of coastal lands to the EPA's failure to act, especially due to the many causes of climate change. U.S. vehicles contribute to only 4% of all global greenhouse gas emissions, according to the petitioners in the case. So even under the best of circumstances, we're only talking about 4% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. And so therefore, they say you can't really say that the EPA's failure to regulate causes the harm to Massachusetts coastline. Okay, and that leads to then into redressability. So I'm going to start down here with the dissent because we just finished with that. But they're saying, well, the petitioners cannot prove that the EPA standards for U.S. vehicular greenhouse gas emissions will prevent Massachusetts' loss of coastal lands. Okay, so small. There's so many factors. The ways in which greenhouse gases cause climate change are complex. There's multifaceted, because not only multiple sources, but just the dynamics, the processes at play are such. I mean, it's quite possible that we are already at the point where even if we start cutting back, we're going to continue to have a warming climate, right? I mean, there are some scientists who say that. And so, so according to the dissent, that it's not clear that if the EPA were to regulate vehicles in the U.S. for greenhouse gas emissions, that would stop or slow climate change, and this is just a small incremental step, and so forth. And so this is not an effective remedy. This is merely speculative, that ordering the EPA to consider whether or not to regulate greenhouse gases, will that actually do anything to protect the coastline, right? Because it's the injuries. The redressability is the court's action and its relationship to the injury, redressing the injury. Okay, so that is the dissent. The majority says, okay, you got to start somewhere. Okay, this is a huge problem, but small incremental steps can indeed be addressed by courts, and particularly where the plaintiff's injuries are due to many causes and require many solutions. And it would be unreasonable to expect of the Congress or the agency to never act simply because they can't control all the causes of a problem. And so therefore, yes, ordering the agency to at least consider the regulation of greenhouse gases from U.S. vehicles is a start towards a step that will contribute to improved conditions for Massachusetts, according to the majority. Okay. So a significant standing case, and obviously 5-4, not clear. This would actually come out the same way today, given the makeup of the court, but who knows? Maybe 15, 20 years down the line, it would be, even stronger than this. I mean, who knows, right? I mean, so one of the things that's key here is to recognize how the court is wrestling with the basic rules of standing, those haven't changed, right? We went through the basic elements and so forth, but looking at these complex environmental problems and the standing of different kinds of parties. Now, we need to be careful here. One is, don't get carried away. There was there's no basis in this lawsuit at all for the court, for any justices on the court, to assert that environmental groups had standing, because again, their harm is different than the state of Massachusetts, right? Does everybody see that? So part of what was going on here had to do with the state's very particular authority and duties. Right? Questions? All right. So beyond the constitutional minimum, which is Article 3 standing, what we just addressed, there are the prudential limits on standing. Prudential limits are self-policing limits adopted by the courts. Okay, self-policing limits adopted by the courts, and these are not mandated by the Constitution, but they are standing rules. They're standing rules that the courts have adopted basically to say, hey, we don't want a lot of lawsuits where maybe you can get over the bare minimum required by Article 3, but really this is not what Congress intended for the courts to be involved in decided. Okay? So, and they are three. First of all, the plaintiff's claim, the plaintiff's injury has to be within the zone of interest that Congress contemplated when enacting the statute. Secondly, the plaintiff cannot assert injuries to third parties. And third, the plaintiff's claim cannot be just a generalized grievance, not just a generalized grievance. So, when we talk about the zone of interest, this is something that is determined by congressional intent, which in turn is determined by looking at the language of the statute itself and the structure of the statute. Language and structure and purpose, I'm sorry, so purpose, language, and structure of the statute, and determining what kinds of interest Congress intended to protect. We'll look at some examples of that. Secondly, the grievance must not be too broadly generalized. You're like, okay, well, that's not very helpful, but that is the rule, right? That's the statement that the courts use over and over again. As you can imagine, that gives the courts a fair amount of leeway to decide whether a claim is too general or not. Third, the plaintiff can assert only injuries to herself, not to third parties. But notice, organizational standing is distinguished. An organization can assert standing on behalf of its members, but it can't assert standing on behalf of others. Okay? So, when we look at the zone of interest, we look at congressional intent, and we look at the particular provision that is at question. So if the plaintiff is suing under section 1712, and we look at what kinds of interest did Congress intend to protect by enacting 1712, not just the overall purpose of the act. And Congress can expand or contract the zone of interest, but that is different than the injury in fact. Okay? Injury in fact is an Article III minimum, what they call an inalterable constitutional minimum. So you have to separate those out. There has to be an injury in fact where the courts just don't have jurisdiction. Then, if you're asking, is that injury within the zone of interest, then at that point you're looking at the congressional intent with respect to the particular provision that is alleged to have been violated. So let's look at the classic case, Lujan versus National Wildlife Federation, and this is oftentimes referred to as Lujan 1. Okay? Lujan was a Secretary of the Interior, and this basically has to do with withdrawing certain lands from the public domain, and then decisions to reclassify those lands and put them back in the public domain. Okay, so that's the issue, and so this involves area up here in sort of northwestern Arizona, and what was happening is basically the Department of Interior wanted to make those lands more available for either grazing or mineral development, oil, gas, mining, etc. Okay, so that was the gist, and they had been taken out of the classifications that would allow for that development and set aside for more, it's not truly wilderness, but set aside for protection. And then the agency now wanted to reclassify them and put them back in the category of lands that would be available for development. So just a bit about this. The public domain was all of these vast lands in the West, in the American West, that as those states were first territories, those were then federal lands, and as the states came into the Union, Congress had to decide what to do with them. And so there was a whole era of disposition of the public domain. Okay, so for example, Kansas, where I grew up, was almost entirely disposed of by the Homestead Act or by grants of land to railroad companies, to the railroads, and there was almost no federal lands that were kept in Kansas other than military installations, okay, military bases. In contrast, Nevada is something like 87% or 89% or something in that range federal land. Okay? Almost all of Nevada is still owned by the federal government. Okay? So this is one of the issues in the American West. You saw some reference to it in the prairie dog and grasslands problem that we're going to come back to discussing in more detail. But this makes people who live in western states, I mean, some of them love it if they particularly love having, the national parks and the federal lands there. Many people who live in western states, though, dislike it. They dislike it. They feel like the federal government has disproportionate power in their states, disproportionate control of the resources, and they feel like they're different than other states. Kentucky, Kansas, right? All places where almost all of the land is privately owned or state and local and so forth. And there's a handful of federal lands, right? We have some Mammoth Cave National Park, Daniel Boone National Forest, Fort Knox, okay? But just think, of all the land in Kentucky, that's not very much, right? Not very much federal control. Again, if you go out to the west, a lot of federal control. But what we saw is that there was a period where Congress's main intent was to dispose of the public domain, get it into private hands. Then what we saw was retention of public land. So that's again why the West is different than the Great Plains or the Midwest or the East. Okay? And so we saw the closing of the open range, the withdrawing of lands from the public domain. Then, over time, and this is going to be important to us in a lot of ways, we saw what's called the era of management, where now, all of a sudden, Congress started passing statutes and federal agencies started managing public lands for multiple uses. Conservation uses, water protection uses, wildlife uses, mining, grazing, development-oriented uses, recreational uses, and so on and so forth. And so multiple uses and so forth. And over time, what has happened is it has become clear that despite mandates from Congress for most agencies to use most federal lands for multiple uses, that is one of these typical things that we were sort of critical of Congress the last week about, which is that's like you can have it all. You can be, tall and short at the same time, right? I mean, you can, right? There's this whole sort of thing that you can have it all. Well, I mean, obviously that's not the case. I mean, you can't protect species in their native habitat with their with their natural processes and also strip mining. They can't. There's sort of multiple uses. That's just not. I mean, at some point you get some inconsistencies, and so that has led to some confusion over what to do about lands that have been withdrawn from the public domain. And so there have been several sort of series of efforts by federal agencies to engage in some land use planning to clarify and reclassify what lands so that you might be able to have more lands available for disposition and mineral exploitation. Now this is a different sort of set of issues. It's similar to, but it's a different set of issues from the national monuments, which are designated under the Antiquities Act. So somebody is going to ask me very soon about Bears Ears in Utah, okay? That has some similar underlying issues, but it is a very particular statute with a very particular set of authority and decision-making that goes with it. So hold on to your questions about Bears Ears and other national monuments. This is more about the public domain, particularly what are called BLM lands, Bureau of Land Management lands, okay? So basically, there's a land withdrawal review program that was adopted as a rule, and the allegation by the National Wildlife Federation and others was that this violated the Federal Land Policy and Management Act and the National Environmental Policy Act. We're going to study both of those statutes more later, but the Supreme Court says there is no citizen suit available for either one. Neither statute has a citizen suit provision in it, so that leads us to the Administrative Procedure Act, Section 702, as a basis for the lawsuit. Okay? And the question is, so in other words, a claim that the agency acted in an arbitrary and capricious way, abused its discretion, and acted not in accordance with the law, right? Everybody sound familiar, right? Okay, so APA claim. And the question is there a final agency action, and is there standing? And the answer to both of those is no. Okay, the answer to both of those is no. There is no final agency action, and there is no injury in fact. So the court says that when the BLM makes decisions about very specific pieces of land, that is a final agency action. So if they say, we are going to put this piece of land in this classification, we're going to take that piece of land from this classification, move it to this other, okay, that now becomes a final agency action. But what happened is the plaintiffs were challenging the land withdrawal review program. A land withdrawal review program. And that is, according to the court, not an agency action, and it's certainly not a final agency action. It is a program of continuing operations, basically a collection of a bunch of actions that are organized around a common set of policies or purposes. Okay? And so basically they say the APA doesn't allow you to challenge the policy direction that an agency is taking, or the plans that the agency is making, or the goals that they have. Instead, you have to challenge discrete or particular agency actions on a case-by-case basis. In addition, okay, so no agency action, so that means no APA claim. In addition, of course, the court doesn't stop there. They say no standing. There is no injury here. And what they say is that actually the prudential requirements have been met because recreational use and aesthetic enjoyment fall within the zone of interest contemplated by these statutes. So Congress intended to protect people's interest in recreational use and aesthetic enjoyment of these lands. But the plaintiffs did not meet the constitutional minimum of injury in fact because they didn't plead with enough specificity about how particular government agency actions would specifically affect their recreational use and aesthetic enjoyment of particular areas of land. Okay? And the plaintiffs had claimed that they recreate in and aesthetically enjoy lands in the vicinity of the government action. And basically what the court says is, okay, what they're trying to do is challenge this big, massive area of lands, federal lands, multiple parcels. They're going to be treated in different ways, in which there's likely going to be some mining activity that either has occurred or will occur, but the plaintiffs did not identify specific parcels and specific uses of those particular parcels. Okay? Does everybody see the problem there? Okay? So no standing in that particular case. Now, I mentioned I put it was on an earlier slide, but like benefit, advantages, and disadvantages, right? I'm just going to cut to the chase on that. Obviously, what the National Wildlife Federation is trying to do is to challenge the validity of the entire approach of the Bureau of Land Management to convert these lands. I mean, the Bureau of Land Management has a plan. And their plan is to convert these lands into categories that will allow for mining. And basically, their plan is ultimately to open up a whole bunch of lands in this area to mining, right? And so the National Wildlife Federation is challenging that and saying, hey, that is not what Congress intended here, right? So this would be a judicially efficient approach if the court were to say, you're right, Congress intended for these lands to have environmental protection. They're not having environmental protection through mining. This is not the kind of thing Congress wanted the agency to be doing. And let's just put a stop to the whole thing. Okay? And that's more efficient. One suit, one decision, boom, we get the agency back on the right track, doing the right thing. Right? That's the theory. In contrast, though, what this says, in essence, is that the environmental groups have to have a very specific, particular interest in each and every parcel and challenge the reclassification of each and every parcel, right? You just think about how many lawsuits that is, right? I mean, it's a whole bunch of lawsuits. Okay, obviously costly to the environmental groups, costly to the agency to defend, and costly to the courts to hear each and every one of those lawsuits, right? So not efficient in the sense of litigation cost, but why? Why is the court insisting on this? Okay, because the court is insisting on the most precise, specific information about the agency's decision possible, right? First of all, they want to make sure that any plaintiff challenging the action is going to suffer a concrete and particular injury with respect to the particular land in question. That's basically an issue related to the power of the courts, okay? And so that's the first thing. But then in terms of the final agency action, it might be the case that some reclassifications are permissible and some are not, right? There might be facts that vary. I mean, okay, so to us, sitting here in Kentucky, the entirety of northwestern Arizona seems pretty similar, pretty uniform and whatnot, but when you actually get down to it, right, there might be some parcels that don't have any particularly sensitive species. There might be some parcels that are particularly amenable to mining and some for which mining makes no difference, no sense at all, right? I mean, you sort of see the issues. And so the court wants challenges on an discrete agency action by discrete agency action, okay? So that is the essence of Lujan 1. So now we turn to Lujan 2. Right? And Lujan 2 is not a continuation of Lujan 1. Okay? This is not just that goes down to the trial level and comes back up on appeal. This is just, Lujan kept being the Secretary of the Interior and Lujan's actions kept being challenged. And so this has to do with the use of federal funds in other nations that might result in harm to federally listed endangered and threatened species. So some of this had to do with a development project in Egypt that was going to harm an endangered crocodile, and so on and so forth. Okay? And the take on face value, the court assumed for purposes of argument that the expenditure of the federal funds was going to be the key element of these development actions that would then actually harm endangered species. Okay, so the court is going to assume that, but they say that doesn't matter because the plaintiffs have no standing because they didn't plead that they have imminent plans to travel abroad to observe and enjoy the species in their overseas locales. So the plaintiffs said, we care about these species, we like to go and see them in their overseas locales, and we won't be able to do that. And at one point the court says they don't even have a plane ticket, much less they don't even have concrete plans, much less a plane ticket in hand to go see the species. And so they said they're not actually going to suffer any injury. And this is important. This is Scalia, of course, right? Justice Scalia. And so it's an important case because it's an interesting illumination of the relationship between the law and environmental science. Okay? So environmental law includes both law and environmental science, right? We've talked about that. That's just sort of a basic of environmental law, is it's got both. But this is a situation where in order to establish standing, the law part makes a whole lot more difference than this environmental science part. So one argument is the ecosystem nexus, right? If that these species are part of a broader ecosystem that the plaintiffs enjoy, experience, appreciate, and their ability as plaintiffs to enjoy, experience, etc., the ecosystem is going to be harmed if you start killing off key components of the ecosystem. Right? So that's the ecosystem nexus argument in essence. And you're getting sort of the boiled down version, but that's the gist of it. The animal nexus argument is that, hey, I really care deeply about crocodiles, and I'm being harmed, I'm being injured if we drive the crocodiles into extinction with our federal funding. Okay? The vocational nexus argument is I'm a scientist, I study crocodiles, I will have nothing more to study if you use federal dollars to kill off the crocodiles, to drive them into extinction. Right? So those are the three arguments in essence. And Scalia, of course, is makes fun of them, is dismissive and so forth, right, about these arguments. But the gist, sort of snarking this aside, the gist, though, is that Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution requires that there be a more concrete and particularized injury than this idea that, environmental science tells us that all of nature is a complex web and we're all affected when we harm any part of it. Okay? That last part is true. It's true scientifically. It is the basis of environmental ethics, like Aldo Leopold's land ethic, and we'll talk about that sometime later in the course. So those are true from a scientific or ethical perspective, but from a legal perspective, when you ask the federal courts to get involved to remedy a federal action or inaction, the plaintiffs have to have concrete and particularized injury. You can't just sort of say it's all one big connection, and so therefore everybody's harmed by any adverse environmental action, right? Does everybody sort of see the gist, right? You can agree, disagree, whatever with the court, but that's the essence of what Scalia is getting at. The basis of this is not environmental science, it's not environmental ethics, it's Article 3 of the Constitution. Okay? So that is the gist. On the other hand, if you are a regulated party, you are more likely to have standing. Okay? If you are somebody who is wants to do mining in northwestern Arizona, and you aren't being allowed by the federal government to mine the area that's the endangered, the home of the endangered, whatever other species, or if you make money off of making crocodile boots and so forth, and you can't. No, and I do not have any, so no crocodile boots. But anyway, you're in the listing of the species as endangered means that that's going to harm your business of making crocodile boots. Then you have an interest, a concrete, particularized interest that is being affected by the federal government's, federal agency's action or inaction. And so the classic case is Bennett versus Speer, which is the Endangered Species Act, and they say economic and business interests are within the zone of interest under the Endangered Species Act for listing locations because the ESA specifically says that those decisions about whether or not to list species as endangered or not in the locations in which their habitats are specifically require the best scientific and commercial data available. Best scientific and commercial data available is language in the statute itself. And so the court says that shows that Congress intended those whose economic interests are going to be affected by listing to be within the zone of interest. Okay? Zone of interest. So that is Bennett versus Speer. Yes?
How does the economic interest principle coincide with the vocational nexus argument that was rejected in Lujan 2?
Right. So generally, the thing is usually with the people who are asserting economic interest, they're actually asserting that they have a particular business activity that is going to be harmed in a very particular way by this listing decision. What the implication of Lujan 2 is though that if the scientist had said, I have plans, I have a grant for next semester to go and study the crocodile in Egypt, and I'm not going to be able to do that now, and I'm going to lose my grant because it's now gone extinct. Okay, that would pass. That would be enough for Article 3 standing. Okay, does you see where I'm going with that?
Yeah.
So not just I care about them, right? So if you, for example, here's the equivalent for Bennett versus Speer. I make cowboy boots generally. I might in the future want to make crocodile boots. Okay, that's not going to, even under Bennett versus Speer, that's not going to be enough to pass. Do you see where I'm coming from on that? Okay, good question. All right? Yes.
What if you made alligator boots?
Probably again, you got to have a specific concrete plan to make crocodile boots. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's. But that, I mean, so it works both ways on that. Okay, so it's got to be. You've got to have actual. It's going to be actual or imminent, right?
Is there no like good replacement theory or anything like that?
Well, I mean, okay, so if you were to say, we're anticipating a decline in alligators, and now we're going to, in our replacement plan is to switch to crocodile. Maybe now you've got something that is, even if it's not immediate, it's imminent enough. Okay, right? You see, but we're it's kind of, where do you get close enough? But no, you're still going to have something that is more both concrete and particularized and actually imminent. Okay? So that is the challenge there. All right, ripeness. So if a decision is not ripe for review, again, there is no Article 3 jurisdiction. The court does not have jurisdiction. And part of the idea here is that the courts, federal courts, do not issue advisory opinions, do not make rulings on hypothetical issues or hypothetical conflicts. And so there are three questions that the courts will ask in order to determine whether a decision is ripe or not. Will delayed review cause hardship to the plaintiffs? Will judicial intervention inappropriately interfere with further administrative action? And will courts benefit from further factual development of the issues presented? So, no, again, like I said, no Article 3 jurisdiction if the case is not ripe. The idea behind this to prevent the courts through avoidance of premature adjudication from entangling themselves in abstract disagreements or interfering with what the administrative agencies are doing until the decision has been formalized and its effects felt in a concrete way by the challenging parties, by the plaintiffs. Okay, so in other words, two things. One is we're not just going to take a hypothetical situation or an abstract policy direction, right? So there's no ripeness until you have very specific actions, and if the agency's actions are still unfolding, if the administrative process is still unfolding and the decision has not been formalized, it is not being actually implemented yet, then it is premature. So this is all about timing. At what point in that ongoing process? And this is particularly relevant in environmental law because there are lots of steps in the administrative process in environmental law. Okay, so the question is, when are we far enough along that there is something going on? So one of the key cases on this is Ohio Forestry Association versus Sierra Club, which had to do with the Wayne National Forest in Ohio, and this also had to do with a plan. So you're starting to see things like plans and programs generally are very difficult to challenge. And it's very difficult to have APA, claim of action, to establish a claim under the APA, and it's very difficult to establish Article 3 jurisdiction to challenge a plan or program by an agency. Why? Because the courts want the very particular actions. That's what they want to see the litigation be over. Okay? So this was a plan that was developed, set of standards that involved clear cutting of parts of the forest. In general, there's a whole line of cases that says Congress does not want the Forest Service to engage in clear cutting. Right? So that's contrary to congressional intent in the statutes. There's language in the federal forest statutes regarding selection of trees on an individualized basis. Clear cutting is where you go in and you take an area and you cut down all the trees in that area. The Forest Service likes clear cutting. Why?
Because they get business?
Yeah, it's just easier, right? It's less costly, it's less time consuming, right? If you have to go and pick tree by tree, okay, that takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of human resources, it's more difficult to do, you gotta get the machinery in, and take this one out, but not that one, and so forth. So much easier, just come on, right? And so we have lots of lawsuits that have percolated through the federal courts over the years, challenging the U.S. Forest Service's clear-cutting methods. This was a challenge to a plan that included clear-cutting. And the court says it is not ripe yet because there is, as it says, considerable legal distance between the adoption of the plan and the time a tree is cut. And the court was looking instead for site-specific decisions with on-the-ground impacts. Plans are not rules, and so forth. And Congress could have put in the statute some sort of provision. And so there's a variety of questions that get asked. Do the provisions of the plan command anyone to do anything or refrain from doing anything? Do they establish, do they grant particular permits? Do they subject anyone to civil or criminal liability? Do they create legal rights or remedies? So these are all questions the court asks, and then basically they say no. It's just a plan, right? Okay. Do they inflict significant legal harm, practical legal harm on the plaintiffs by preventing them from bringing their legal challenges at a time when the harm is more imminent or certain? And they said no. Do the plan's provisions force the plaintiffs to modify their behavior in order to avoid future adverse consequences? Well, possibly, but the court says, well, it's not that bad. And then the fact that the environmental group wants to engage in cost-saving, litigation-reducing approaches to tackle the plan as a whole, right? This is just what we talked about in the other case, right? That's not enough. You have to have a final agency action, and the claim has to be ripe, okay? And so that means a very specific decision about very specific cutting actions, or very specific tree cutting actions. Okay, so one of the challenges here is what is the role of the plan with respect to administrative agencies? So in general, plans, for the most part, are not rules. They are guidelines. Okay, so those of you who will take land use in the spring will get your dose of Pirates Code of the Caribbean, because I actually use that in an article. It's actually gotten re-quoted a bunch, this is about local comprehensive plans, and it's basically, in the Pirates of the Caribbean at the very end, the very first movie at the very end, they keep invoking the Pirates Code, and at the end they say, well, Pirates Code is more like guidelines than actual rules, okay? And so that's exactly what plans are. And the thing is, plans have some legal significance. The specific agency action has to be consistent with the plan. That is a typical rule of law. The agency actions have to be consistent with the plan. But what counts as consistent or not is pretty broad, open to a lot of interpretation. Plans can be amended, modified, and it's not entirely clear what the legal remedy is if there is some inconsistency between the agency action and the plan. So what very specifically does the agency action have to be consistent with? What's the real rule? So agency action has to be consistent with the, yes, the statute. The statute. Where does the agency get its power to act? From the statute, right? Does everybody see that? Okay, and that is really what's going on in the cases. I mean, if we want to challenge the U.S. Forest Service cutting some trees, right, we can bring a claim at the time at which a specific cutting decision is made and say that this cutting is inconsistent with Congress's statute. It violates the law, right? It violates the statute for cutting. Okay, so that's the gist of that. Okay. So we're basically back to case-by-case judicial challenges. All right, exhaustion of administrative remedies. A person challenging any an administrative action has to exhaust all their administrative remedies, including appeals, before seeking judicial review. This protects the administrative agency's authority and promotes judicial efficiency. The APA requires this. Okay? So as long as the statute or regulation requires exhaustion, then you cannot bring a claim under the APA unless administrative appeals have been exhausted. Okay, and this is pretty straightforward. There are two things that I want to point out. One is not in the slides, but I'm going to tell you right now, the Supreme Court has come up with another theory of jurisdiction that kind of bridges the area between ripeness and exhaustion of administrative remedies, and it's called primary jurisdiction. Primary jurisdiction. And primary jurisdiction is the idea that the federal courts do not have Article III jurisdiction when the matter is something that is very complex and technical and within the agency's specialized expertise. So basically, they want the agency to figure it out first, and even if even if the harm is imminent and it's concrete and particularized and so on and so forth, the plaintiffs do not have the ability to bring the lawsuit into federal court, or if they do, the federal court must dismiss it if the doctrine of primary jurisdiction is involved. If it is something that really should not be being decided by the courts on the first level, at the first level, it really needs to be decided by the administrative agency. I bring this up because you need to be aware about the doctrine of primary jurisdiction, but also because when I was in the practice of law, I had a client. There was a big multinational corporation. This was actually not an environmental issue. It turned out it was a labor and employment issue, but somehow my firm made me as a lowly associate get involved in this appeal and so forth. And the thing is, our client had lost badly, like really badly, in federal district court in a series of 2 or 3 decisions that took up 100 pages or more in FSUP, okay? And what had happened is the federal trial judge, federal district judge, had made all kinds of factual finding about a very complex labor arrangement. I didn't know anything about labor law, by the way. I didn't have the slightest clue. What I did know, though, was that this was something that the relevant federal agency, they should have been making those decisions first, not the federal district court. And so I brought up the doctrine of primary jurisdiction because that was the only way that we had any chance of winning. Why? What do we know about factual findings on appeal? Right? The federal district court's factual findings on appeal will be overturned only if they are clearly erroneous. Clearly erroneous. That is the standard. Okay? So embrace this. Embrace this now, because you will go out there and you will get involved in some appeal and you will argue to the appellate court that the trial court's decision was wrong, and the appellate court will smack you away like a mosquito, because they will say, we will not overturn the trial court's factual findings unless they are clearly erroneous, right? Okay, so do not try to retry the facts in the appellate court. That is not a winning approach. Not a winning approach. What is the winning approach is to say the trial court never had jurisdiction to begin with under the doctrine of primary jurisdiction, and we did not raise it at the trial level, but we didn't have to because you can raise jurisdiction at any time. If it is beyond the Article 3 powers of the federal court, it can be raised at any time, right? You remember me saying this the other day, right? Okay? And lo and behold, this was the argument. The appellate judges loved it. They made a point of saying so in the argument. The other side immediately turned to us and said, we want to settle this now. And this client was worth over $1 million of business to the law firm. And after that, I could come in to work at whatever time I wanted. So learning something about primary jurisdiction is beneficial to you in a very personal, individual way. All right. The Chrysler versus the U.S. Forest Service. This is the Allegheny National Forest. Pretty pictures, but anyway, the gist here is that at the administrative agency level, what had happened in this case is the environmental groups had made a bunch of very general arguments, comments about why the agency couldn't do what they were going to do with the forest, and then when they got to challenging the agency's action, by the time they got to the appellate level, they had honed their arguments. They had much more sophisticated arguments. They're just like very vague, general, low-level arguments at the administrative level, and then they developed more sophisticated arguments at the appellate level. And the court says, no, you didn't raise these specific claims in the administrative agency decision-making. You cannot raise them now. You cannot raise them now, okay? This is, and the court talks about what's called monkey wrenching. Okay, monkey wrenching is a term that comes from some writing by Edward Abbey. Anybody know Edward Abbey?
Yep.
Oh, you do? Okay, yeah, a couple of you. Okay, so he wrote a book called Desert Solitaire. He was an ardent environmentalist, sort of anti-technology guy who lived out in the desert. Okay, and basically he thought, society was going to hell in a handbasket with all the environmental harm, and that one of the things that we should do is take monkey wrenches to the bulldozers and various construction equipment that was coming in to bulldoze the desert or whatever, right? So I mean, he basically argued for basically illegal activity, right? To basically do anything to stop the environmental harm. That was sort of the gist. Okay, fair enough. Yeah. Okay. This was sort of the gist, and so from that came this idea of legal monkey wrenching, which is just gum it up, make it, bring a lot of participate in decision making by just like throwing everything at the agency in the hopes that the whole thing will just sort of fall apart. That people will, the Forest Service won't make the decision that they were planning to make, that the timber company will just walk away, and so forth. So rather than really engage in sort of deliberation and debate over should we do A versus B, instead file a whole bunch of Freedom of Information Act lawsuits, requests, file a bunch of lawsuits, paper the agency with lots of comments and so on and so forth. And so that's the idea of legal monkey wrench. All right. So a lot of law. All right. So now, we got only 5 minutes, but I'm going to get started with this, and then we'll finish it up. So, of course, episode 4, it has to have a Star Wars component, right? So, I mean, professors have to have fun too. So, writing an article with a Star Wars theme. All right. So, I can't do the Star Wars music, so you imagine the Star Wars theme in your mind, okay? I couldn't also get this where it scrolls this way. I don't have mad technology skills, so anyway. But this is in the article, so I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to read that. So, but basically, what we're talking about is environmental law is not just a thing, okay? Environmental law is changing. It is influenced by the pace and magnitude of ecological change, by the complexity and multidimensionality of our problems, by the pace and magnitude of social change. And so what we see is the evolution of a variety of generations. Now, we talked about the whole sort of public domain a little bit earlier. There is a whole bunch of environmental law that existed before Earth Day 1970, okay? So there's a whole bunch of environmental, there's the various statutes governing federal lands and federal resources, water resources and public lands and all that kind of stuff. Forests, national forests, a lot of those laws were adopted a long time ago. There was common law doctrine, okay? Georgia versus Tennessee Cooper, right? Georgia versus Tennessee Copper, right? That is public nuisance law, okay? That's existed since, I don't know, William the Conqueror, long time, right? But it goes back all the way to England. Public trust doctrine, ancient, goes back to ancient Rome, okay? So there's a lot of environmental law that existed. But all of these statutes and the sort of bulk of what we think of as environmental law really came about sort of starting in the early 70s. And so I showed you kind of a series of, evolution. This might actually be closer to what it looks like, okay? So just so that you know. But this is the essence of the generational evolution of environmental law since the adoption of the first sort of major pollution control statutes and sort of modern environmental statutes in the early 70s. And these were command and control statutes and regulations using technology-based standards and what we call rule of law litigation. So that's what we've been talking about, right? You sue under the APA or the citizen suit provision of the statute, and you say the agency is not following the law that Congress enacted. Okay? And by the way, most of these statutes were enacted when Richard Nixon was president. Okay? And then we saw what was called the second generation of environmental law, where there was sort of a pushback against all of these sort of top-down command and control regulations. Said, hey, we need more regulatory flexibility, and we need to harness market incentives. And a lot of this happened when Ronald Reagan was president. Then it didn't take very long before we sort of saw the third generation. come along, which is more collaborative, decentralized, focused on voluntary processes, outcomes-based choices of different instruments to use, called reflexive law, public-private partnership, basically get people to, and stakeholders in industry and various parties to choose to protect the environment and to collaborate together, and a lot of focus on sustainable development and sustainability. And then, as you see in the reading, I'm arguing that we've entered sort of a fourth generation, which is focused more on things like adaptation, resilience, integration, and multimodality is just sort of the toolbox approach. Okay, so that is the essence of, so we see the things. Now, part of what we're going to discuss, we're going to kind of work our way through the rest of this, but part of what we're going to discuss is then, now are we yet in an entirely new generation? Is this where, the environmental law is maybe the family, so it's kind of an all in the family kind of thing, right? There's each new generation doesn't displace the other ones, it's just new parts of new people in the family, new generations that come along. But maybe like we're killing off grandma now, I don't know. We're going to talk about that. We have a good discussion about that, so that's where we're going to go. So come prepared to talk about, where are we now?
Yeah.
Oh, and this is the all in the four generations, the all in the family approach. Okay. So let's pick up right here with this